It started as an ordinary day. A man went to work, a young family struggled to make ends meet, and in a quiet street in Notting Hill, the walls of an old terraced house hid a terrible secret. The address was 10 Rillington Place. If you walk there today, you won't find it. The street was demolished in the 1970s, its name erased from the maps, as if the city itself wanted to forget. But for decades before, it was home to ordinary people. Couples, lodgers, factory workers, living side by side in the faded remains of Victorian London. One of them was Timothy Evans, a 25-year-old van driver, his wife Beryl, and their baby daughter Geraldine. They weren't rich, they weren't educated, but they were trying to build a life like so many others in post-war Britain. What happened to them would expose the cracks in an entire justice system and lead to one of the gravest miscarriages of justice in British history. When I first opened the archive files on Evans, I expected a simple case, a confession, a conviction, an execution, tragic but straightforward. But as I read deeper through the old police statements, the trial transcripts, and the letters sent in protest after his hanging, it became clear. Nothing about this story was simple. Because 3 years after Evans was executed, the man everyone had overlooked, the quiet neighbour who seemed so polite and helpful, was exposed as a serial murderer. His name was John Christie, and the truth he buried beneath the floorboards would change Britain forever. This is the story of the man Britain hanged by mistake, and how a single wrongful execution began to turn the tide against capital punishment. To understand what happened at 10 Rillington Place, you first have to understand what life was like there. It was 1949, a time when London was still patching itself back together after the war. Bomb damage scarred whole neighbourhoods, rationing was still in place, and housing was in such short supply that families would take whatever they could find. Rillington Place in Notting Hill wasn't the fashionable postcode it is today. Back then, it was a warren of cramped rooms, shared lavatories, and peeling wallpaper. The smell of damp never quite left the air. Residents shared more than walls. They shared noise, smells, and each other's business. Privacy was a luxury no one could afford. Timothy Evans moved in with his wife Beryl and baby Geraldine in 1948. They rented the top-floor flat, a single small room with a scullery and access to the shared toilet on the landing. He was a van driver, working odd jobs to make ends meet. Beryl stayed home to care for their daughter. They were young, hopeful, and struggling, like so many working-class couples in post-war Britain. By all accounts, Evans was a talkative man, cheerful but not bright. His reading and writing were poor, something that would later count heavily against him. Friends described him as well-meaning, occasionally boastful, but devoted to his wife and daughter. Beryl, just 20, was described as lively and pretty, though neighbours sometimes heard raised voices through the thin walls. Downstairs lived John Christie, a middle-aged man who worked as a clerk and part-time special constable during the war. He lived with his wife, Ethel, and kept to himself. He was quiet, polite, and seemed respectable, the kind of neighbour who might lend a hand or share advice. To the Evanses, struggling with money and a young child, Christie appeared to be the sort of man who knew things, practical, worldly, trustworthy. In a place like Rillington Place, where small kindnesses mattered, it was easy to accept help when it was offered. No one in that crumbling terrace could have imagined what kind of evil was hiding behind Christie's calm eyes. When I looked through the old photographs of the street, narrow, grey and heavy with soot, I couldn't help thinking how ordinary it all was. The kind of place you'd walk past without a second glance. But behind one of those doors, the lives of 3 people were about to unravel in a way that would haunt Britain for generations. By November 1949, the small flat at 10 Rillington Place had become a place of tension. Timothy Evans and his wife Beryl were struggling, financially and emotionally. Arguments were frequent, and neighbours often heard shouting through the thin floorboards. Evans later told police that Beryl had spoken of ending her life. He claimed she couldn't face another year of poverty. He also said that their neighbour, John Christie, had offered to help. Christie, a former police constable and clerk, had cultivated a reputation as a calm, respectable man who knew about medical matters. When Beryl confided that she was pregnant again and desperate, Christie told the couple he could help her have an abortion. At the time, abortion was illegal in Britain, and such offers, though dangerous, weren't unheard of. What happened next remains one of the darkest and most disputed moments in British criminal history. According to Evans's first statement to police, he returned home one day to find his wife dead, killed accidentally during the attempted abortion. Christie, he said, promised to take care of things, including the baby. Distraught and terrified, Evans claimed he panicked and fled London, leaving Geraldine in Christie's care. It was a story that might have seemed absurd if it hadn't contained a trace of truth. Evans travelled to his hometown of Merthyr Tydfil in Wales, where, racked with guilt and confusion, he went to the local police. His initial confession was confused and contradictory. He told them his wife had died in an accident and that he'd put her body down a drain. When officers searched the property, they found nothing. Scotland Yard was notified and detectives from London took over. They soon discovered the truth, or at least what they believed it to be. On the 2nd of December 1949, the bodies of Beryl and baby Geraldine Evans were found in the wash house at the back of 10 Rillington Place. Both had been strangled. A length of rope was still tied around Geraldine's neck. Timothy Evans was immediately arrested and charged with murder. From that point forward, Christie's name barely appeared in the investigation. Despite being one of the last people to see Beryl alive, and despite having a known interest in medical procedures, police accepted his statement that he'd merely tried to advise the couple and had nothing to do with what followed. The focus turned entirely on Evans. At the time, forensic science was primitive and psychological understanding even more so. There were no fingerprints linking him to the murders, no witnesses placing him at the scene when Beryl and Geraldine died, only his own confused and inconsistent words. Those words would become the rope that hung him. The trial of Timothy Evans began at the Old Bailey on the 11th of January 1950. It lasted just 3 days. He stood accused of the murder of his baby daughter Geraldine, after the Crown decided not to proceed with the charge of killing his wife Beryl. That decision was strategic. It allowed the prosecution to focus on the death of the child, a crime the jury would find impossible to forgive. The case against Evans was built almost entirely on his own confused statements. Over the course of several police interrogations, he gave 4 different versions of what had happened, each one contradicting the last. In one, he blamed Christie. In another, he accepted full responsibility. The detectives claimed these were voluntary confessions. Evans later said they were the product of exhaustion, fear, and confusion. He was poorly educated, could barely read, and had an IQ estimated at around 70. He signed statements he couldn't properly understand. Yet in the courtroom, those signatures became the strongest evidence against him. John Christie appeared as a key witness for the prosecution. Calm, well-spoken and respectable, he told the court that Evans had confessed to him privately, and that he'd tried to calm the young man down. Christie's words carried weight, far more than those of a semi-literate van driver from Notting Hill. Evans's defence, led by Malcolm Morris KC, did what it could, but it was a hopeless fight. There was no forensic evidence proving Evans had killed anyone, but there was no proof to the contrary either. The court heard nothing of Christie's background and nothing about his strange obsessions or his prior criminal record, which included assault and theft. To the jury, Christie seemed like an honest man trying to do the right thing. When the prosecution summed up, they described Evans as a liar and a coward. The motive, they said, was simple: a domestic quarrel turned deadly. His inconsistent statements were painted as guilt, not confusion. The judge, Mr. Justice Lewis, directed the jury carefully, but there was little room for doubt in the atmosphere of 1950 Britain. The death of a child demanded retribution. The jury retired for just 40 minutes before returning their verdict. Guilty. Evans showed little emotion as the words were read. His solicitor later said he seemed dazed, as if he didn't quite grasp what was happening. When asked if he had anything to say before sentence was passed, he shook his head. The judge placed the traditional black cap upon his head and delivered the ancient sentence of death. Evans was led away to Pentonville Prison, where Britain's chief executioner, Albert Pierre Point, would later carry out the order. Outside the courtroom, few questioned the verdict. The press reported it as another grim but just conclusion. Headlines read, "Father to hang for child murder," a line that offered closure to a shocked public but none to the truth. It would be another 3 years before that truth began to emerge, not in the courtroom, but in the very same house where the murders had taken place. Timothy Evans was taken from the Old Bailey to Pentonville Prison in North London, where he would spend the final weeks of his life. He was 25 years old. The press reported the verdict as a relief, a brutal but necessary conclusion to a shocking case. In 1950, executions were a matter of routine. There were no appeals to emotion, no long stays or drawn-out legal wrangling. The machinery of justice moved with quiet precision, and once it was in motion, it rarely stopped. Inside Pentonville, Evans was described by warders as polite, mild, and confused. He asked often about his daughter, apparently still unaware that Geraldine was dead. One chaplain later remarked that he seemed unable to grasp his own situation, as if the full weight of what was happening had not settled on him. His legal team submitted an appeal, but it was rejected within days. There was no new evidence to present, no reason, at least in the eyes of the court, to doubt the verdict. No mention was made of John Christie beyond his courtroom testimony. Evans wrote a few letters in the days before his death. None survive in full, but fragments quoted in later reports suggest a mixture of resignation and confusion. He maintained, as he had from the beginning, that Christie did it. At 9 a.m. on 9th March 1950, Evans was led to the gallows by Britain's chief executioner, Albert Pierre Point. As was his custom, Pierre Point worked swiftly and without spectacle. The official record states the execution took less than 15 seconds from the moment Evans entered the chamber to the time the trapdoor fell. Outside the prison, the crowd was small. A few reporters waited for the notice to be pinned to the gate. The headline that followed in the evening news was simple: "Evans hanged for murder of baby daughter." And that, it seemed, was the end of the matter. For the next 3 years, 10 Rillington Place remained just another shabby London address, a place of whispers and pity, but little more. Evans was buried within the prison grounds, and his name faded quietly from the news. No one yet realized that the true killer was still living downstairs, in the same rooms, surrounded by the ghosts of his victims, including those for which Timothy Evans had died. For 3 years after Timothy Evans was hanged, 10 Rillington Place returned to a kind of uneasy silence. The neighbours changed, tenants came and went, but John Christie remained. Polite, quiet and withdrawn, he lived alone after his wife Ethel, supposedly, went to visit relatives. In March 1953, the new tenant of the ground-floor flat, Beresford Brown, began some repair work. He removed wallpaper in the kitchen and noticed a strange hollow space behind a wooden panel. When he peered inside, he saw something that froze him to the spot. It was a body, wrapped, decayed, and hidden in the alcove. The police were called, and when they began searching the rest of the property, the horror deepened. They found 3 women's bodies in the alcove, including one later identified as Mrs. Ethel Christie. In the garden, they uncovered 2 more skeletons buried in shallow graves. The small terraced house in Notting Hill had become one of the most notorious crime scenes in British history. As detectives pieced the evidence together, Christie was nowhere to be found. He had packed a small case and vanished days earlier. For 10 days, the story gripped the nation. Headlines in every newspaper, crowds gathering outside the house, the police searching trains, stations and shelters. When Christie was finally caught, sitting calmly on a park bench near Putney Bridge, he confessed almost immediately. His crimes, he said, had been compulsions. He admitted to murdering at least 7 women, strangling them, sometimes under the pretense of performing medical procedures. Among his victims were Beryl Evans and her daughter Geraldine. That admission changed everything. Suddenly, the execution of Timothy Evans, long forgotten by the public, came back into focus, not as justice, but as a catastrophic mistake. When I read through the original police files, the most striking thing isn't what they found, but what they'd missed. Christie had lived in that house during the investigation, had helped officers search for evidence, and had been treated as a witness, not a suspect. The rope used to strangle the Evanses matched his later murders almost exactly. Yet in 1949, none of that had seemed suspicious. In their haste to close the case, the police had convicted the wrong man and allowed a serial killer to continue his work for years. As one newspaper wrote at the time, "We hanged an innocent man while the real murderer was helping us look for the bodies." It was a line that haunted Scotland Yard for decades. When the truth about John Christie broke, Britain was stunned. The headlines told the story in blunt, unforgiving words. Murder house horror. Christie admits Rillington killings. Evans was innocent. It was a moment that shattered public trust in the system. For years, people had accepted that the law, however harsh, was fair. Now, that belief was gone. The newspapers that had once printed the words "father to hang" for child murder began publishing apologies and investigations. Columnists demanded to know how such a mistake could have happened. How had the police failed to see what was right under their noses? How had the courts allowed a confused, poorly educated man to die while the real killer went free? In Parliament, questions were asked within days of Christie's confession. Members of both houses called for an inquiry into the Evans case. Some wanted names, detectives, judges, politicians, held to account. Others spoke more cautiously, arguing that the Evans trial had been conducted in good faith, and that the discovery of Christie's crimes, though shocking, didn't necessarily prove Evans's innocence. But the public weren't satisfied with that. They'd seen too much, read too much, and sensed something deeper was wrong. Letters poured into the Times, the Daily Mirror, and the Home Office, demanding justice for Evans's widow and family. "We can never bring him back," one letter read, "but the least we can do is admit the truth." The Metropolitan Police, under pressure, launched an internal review. It was limited, cautious, and defensive. Their conclusion was that no evidence has been found to show that Evans did not murder his child. But that line only deepened public anger. To many, it sounded like denial. The more the press investigated, the worse it looked. Journalists uncovered that Christie had a criminal record. Assault, theft, even a conviction for malicious wounding. Information that had never been disclosed during Evans's trial. He'd also served as a witness in other cases, lending his false respectability to the prosecution of innocent men. In coffee houses, pubs and workplaces, people began asking questions they'd never asked before. If the police could make such a mistake once, how many others had there been? And if the gallows were so final, how could the state ever make things right after the fact? When I read through the letters preserved in the archives, what stands out most isn't the anger, it's the disbelief. Ordinary Britons simply couldn't imagine that such an error was possible. For generations, the phrase British justice had been something to be proud of. After Rillington Place, it became something to fear. As one editorial in the Manchester Guardian put it, the question is no longer whether Timothy Evans was guilty. The question is whether any man can ever be safe while the rope still hangs ready. That single sentence would echo through Westminster for years to come. When the dust settled after John Christie's arrest, the government faced a problem it couldn't ignore. An innocent man had almost certainly been hanged, and the world was watching. In 1953, the Home Secretary, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, announced an inquiry. It would be led by Mr. Justice Scott Henderson, a senior judge with a reputation for caution. His task was simple in theory, but impossible in practice, to determine whether Timothy Evans might in fact have been innocent. But this was not a full public inquiry. It was a limited departmental investigation, conducted largely behind closed doors. There were no witnesses called to testify in public, no cross-examinations, and no journalists in the gallery. The Home Office wanted answers, but it also wanted control. When the Scott Henderson report was published later that year, its conclusions stunned campaigners. It stated that although Christie had murdered several women, Evans had almost certainly killed his wife and daughter. Christie's later crimes, it claimed, were irrelevant to the facts of the Evans case. In short, the establishment cleared itself. The report did little to quieten the storm. If anything, it made things worse. Lawyers, journalists, and MPs condemned it as shallow and self-serving. The language was careful, the reasoning circular. One paper wrote bluntly, "It asks us to believe that a proven liar was truthful once, and only once, when it mattered most." In the House of Commons, several members of Parliament called the inquiry a whitewash. Among them was Sidney Silverman, a long-time campaigner against the death penalty. He told Parliament, "The tragedy of Timothy Evans has shown that capital punishment is a fallible instrument wielded by fallible men." Public pressure didn't fade. The more people learned about Christie's methods, the gassing, the strangulation, the concealment of bodies, the harder it became to believe that Evans, a nervous and barely literate young man, had been capable of the same crimes. By 1954, the Royal Commission on Capital Punishment, which had already been gathering evidence on the wider question of the death penalty, cited the Evans case as an example of why reform was urgently needed. It didn't recommend outright abolition, but it planted a seed of doubt in the national conscience that would never fully die. When I read through the commission transcripts, one passage stands out. A senior police official admitted almost reluctantly, "It is possible that a man may be hanged who is not guilty." It was a small sentence, but a seismic shift. For the first time, an agent of the state had said aloud what the public already knew, that justice once carried out on the gallows, could never be undone. And in that admission, the campaign to abolish the death penalty found its most powerful weapon, doubt. For more than a decade after the Scott Henderson report, the case of Timothy Evans refused to rest. It lingered in the press, in Parliament, and in the public mind, a wound that wouldn't heal. His family never stopped fighting, his half-sister Mary Westlake and his mother, Mary Evans, wrote to MPS, lawyers and journalists, demanding that the government reopen the case. They had no money, no influence, only determination. By the early 1960s, their campaign had gathered momentum. Public feeling had changed. The death penalty itself was under serious scrutiny, and the Evans case had become its most powerful symbol. If the system could hang one innocent man, who was to say there weren't others? In 1961, Ludovic Kennedy, a young journalist and broadcaster, began investigating the case for the BBC. His documentary and subsequent book, 10 Rillington Place, laid out the facts in devastating detail. The false confessions, the police failures, the flawed trial, and Christie's manipulation. Kennedy's work reignited public outrage and forced politicians to act. In 1965, the murder, abolition of death penalty. Act suspended executions in Britain, and a year later, the Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins, announced a fresh investigation into the Evans conviction. This time, it was different. The review was more open, more thorough, and, crucially, independent of the old guard who had overseen the first inquiry. The findings were stark. The evidence against Evans was weak, the police investigation deeply flawed, and Christie's testimony unreliable. On the 16th of October 1966, the government issued a posthumous pardon for Timothy Evans. The official statement was brief but historic. It acknowledged that Evans had been wrongly convicted of the murder of his daughter, Geraldine. His name, at last, was cleared. 16 years too late. Outside Parliament, reporters gathered around Mary Westlake as she spoke to the press. Her voice shook as she said, "I'm grateful it's been done, but it won't bring him back." For many, that was the final word on the matter, but for others it marked the beginning of something larger. The Evans case, alongside Derek Bentley and later Ruth Ellis, became the moral backbone of Britain's movement against the death penalty. It reminded people that justice was not infallible, and that one irreversible mistake was one too many. When I read the news clippings from that day, what strikes me most is the tone. There was no triumph, no celebration, just a quiet sadness, a sense that Britain had finally admitted what it had done, but too late to make it right. As one editorial in The Guardian put it, "We cannot unhang Timothy Evans, but we can ensure no other innocent man meets the same fate." And that perhaps was the only true justice left to find. The case of Timothy Evans didn't just end with a pardon, it changed the way Britain thought about justice. Before Evans, most people accepted the death penalty as a necessary part of law and order. After him, few could see it in quite the same way. The idea that the state could kill an innocent man had moved from the abstract to the undeniable. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, his name was cited again and again in Parliament. Each time MPs debated the death penalty, Evans's story returned, alongside those of Derek Bentley and Ruth Ellis, as evidence that no system, however well-intentioned, could guarantee infallibility. When the Murder, Abolition of Death Penalty Act became permanent in 1969, many saw it as Evans's true vindication. His case had helped turn public opinion and provided a moral anchor for reform, but the legacy runs deeper than the law. It reshaped how Britain viewed authority itself. The Evans affair exposed the dangers of class prejudice, poor policing, and blind faith in officialdom. It showed how an uneducated man could be crushed beneath the machinery of justice simply because he didn't fit the mould of credibility. In the decades since, the story of 10 Rillington Place has been retold in books, films, and documentaries. The most famous, the 1971 film 10 Rillington Place, starring Richard Attenborough as Christie and John Hurt as Evans, brought the horror to a new generation. It was a grim, claustrophobic reminder that evil doesn't always wear a monstrous face, and that justice can fail those least equipped to defend themselves. When I revisited the site of the old Rillington Place, now renamed Ruston Close with new houses and tidy gardens, I was struck by how ordinary it all looked. Children playing, washing lines in the sun, the faint hum of traffic from Ladbroke Grove. Nothing remained of the old brick terrace or the people who once lived there, but beneath the pavement lies a story that changed a nation. Every so often the Evans case is raised again, whenever a new debate about justice or policing emerges, and each time the same question lingers: if it could happen once, could it happen again? For me, the answer lies not in cynicism, but in vigilance. Timothy Evans wasn't a villain or a martyr. He was a man failed by his time, and perhaps his greatest legacy is the reminder that justice must always be questioned, especially when it seems certain. So what happened to John Christie, you may ask? After his arrest in March 1953, John Christie was charged with the murder of his wife, Ethel, though his own confessions suggested there were many more victims. He stood trial at the Old Bailey that June. The evidence against him was overwhelming: the bodies in his house, his detailed admissions, and the grim consistency of his methods. The trial lasted just 4 days. Christie pleaded insanity, claiming he suffered from hysterical blackouts, but the jury rejected the defense within an hour. He was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. On the 15th of July, 1953, he was hanged at Pentonville Prison, the same place where Timothy Evans had been executed 3 years earlier. The same executioner, Albert Pierrepoint, carried out the sentence. When the notice of Christie's execution was pinned to the prison gate, there were no protests, no petitions, and no doubts. For once, Britain agreed. Justice had finally been served. Yet the irony wasn't lost on anyone who remembered the Evans case. The wrong man had gone first. It started as an ordinary day, a young man in Notting Hill, a small flat, a neighbour offering help. By the time it ended, Britain had condemned an innocent man and let a killer walk free. When I stand near the site where 10 Rillington Place once stood, it's hard to imagine the lives that passed through that narrow street: Evans, Beryl, Geraldine, and the man who destroyed them all, John Christie. The houses are gone now, replaced by quiet terraces and new families. Time has done its best to forget. But history remembers. Christie paid with his life, but the damage he caused went far beyond his victims. His crimes exposed how fragile justice can be when shaped by class, assumption, and haste. And the death of Timothy Evans forced Britain to confront an uncomfortable truth: that even the most civilized system can kill the wrong man. When people today ask why Britain abolished the death penalty, it isn't the legal arguments they recall. It's the names: Evans, Bentley, Ellis. Ordinary people, caught in extraordinary circumstances, each revealing a flaw in the certainty the gallows demanded. As a journalist, it's impossible not to feel a kind of chill when you hold the old court records. The ink may have faded, but the decisions remain final, irreversible. Perhaps that's the real lesson of Rillington Place. Justice demands evidence, but it also demands humility. The moment we believe it can't be wrong, it already is. And so, when I close the file on Timothy Evans, one question lingers still. How many others did we never find?